appealing for arms as it struggles to combat ISIL and protect its oil fields. Libya's UN-recognized government asks for fighter jets, tanks and helicopters as talks resume with a rival administration. But are more munitions the answer in a country already awash with weapons? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. 4 years after the uprising that toppled longtime leader Muammar al-Gaddafi, Libya remains a nation divided. Rival governments and their respective armed forces compete for power, and opposing militias battle for control. Well, now the UN is warning the added threat posed by ISIL is real and imminent, saying the group will stop at nothing to consolidate its influence. The Libyan government, recognised by the UN, is pressing for the easing of an arms embargo so it can get hold of heavy weapons to fight ISIL. It's also taking part in UN-brokered talks in Morocco with Libya's legally installed government. Mediators are trying to get the two camps to work together towards a government of national unity.
The overall situation on the ground is deteriorating rapidly, and Libya can no longer afford to allow the political crisis and armed conflict that has gripped the country for much of the past year cannot to fester longer. Unless Libya's leaders act quickly and decisively, the risk of their country's national unity and territorial integrity are real and imminent.
The political and security vacuum benefits first and foremost to the terrorists. We agreed on the urgency to elaborate an appropriate response to this terrorist threat. We welcomed the commitment of all parties in the dialogue, which must lead to the formation of a national unity government to re-establish a sustainable stability and security in Libya and to confront the terrorist threat.
Let's bring in our guest. Joining us on the show from Tobruk is Mohammed Al-Jarh, a non-resident fellow at the Rafiq Hariri Centre for the Middle East. In Oxford, Oliver Miles, a former British ambassador to Libya. And in London, we have Anas el-Gomati, the director of the Sadiq Institute, a think tank based in Tripoli. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Oliver. The Sanctions Committee, it seems, it's sending the signals that it's going to approve this request for arms. Do you think that this is going to go through? Will the Security Council approve it?
I don't know. I believe that they'll be under a lot of pressure to agree. On the other hand, the reasons for withholding arms are also strong, because the fact is that one of Libya's problems, you might almost say the biggest problem as regards the effect on the region is concerned, is that there are too many arms there already. And bringing in more arms without being absolutely certain that they'll be held by the right people would be a big mistake.
How much of a precedent would this set if this arms request is approved? Will this basically be the beginning of the unravelling of the arms embargo?
Well, I suppose you could call it that, although the arms embargo has not been entirely effective even in the past. I don't know the facts, but I know that accusations have been made by both the main parties in Libya that the arms embargo has been ignored. The Tobruk government accused Qatar and Turkey of supplying arms, and the Tripoli government accused Egypt of supplying arms.
Let's bring in Mohammed then. Talking from the perspective there of Tobruk, would allowing more arms into Libya really solve the conflict, Mohammed? I mean, some do echo the sentiments we heard from Oliver that the area is already awash in weapons. Why on earth would we want more weapons in Libya?
Is the solution to Libya's problem a military solution only? Of course not. We have to work on so many parallel tracks in Libya. However, just because there are too many weapons in Libya is not an excuse to withhold the arms from the internationally recognized government. We have to understand that the arms that we are talking about in Libya are in the hands of militias and are in the hands of terrorist groups such as Ansar al-Sharia and the Islamic State in Libya. And unless we make sure that we engage with the internationally recognized forces and those that are willing to fight the extremist and terrorist groups in Libya, then we will see the terrorist groups such as Ansar Sharia and Islamic State acquiring more territory in Libya and being able to exert more influence.
But Mohammed, doesn't the Tobruk-based administration, forgive me for interrupting you, but doesn't also the Tobruk-based administration receive weapons? Isn't it common knowledge now that you're also getting military backup from other countries in the region? Egypt, I think, has acknowledged that it's carrying out airstrikes. The UAE, at least, it's been suggested or accused, depending on how you're looking at it, that it's participating.
This is, you're absolutely right, Sami, and I believe this is more reason why the international community should be more proactive and make sure that any intervention or arms that are flowing in Libya are under international oversight and international authorization, and regional powers such as Egypt and Algeria and others should be able to play a better role at ensuring that the arms flow in Libya, in or out of Libya, is monitored, and also to make sure that we control the flow not just of the arms, but also from the terrorists.
Right, it's not correct then to say that the only parties with weapons right now, or the parties with the most weapons right now, is only one side or only groups like ISIS. Clearly there is a lot of international backing for all sides, including the Tobruk administration. Let me bring Anas el-Gomati into this question now. What do you make of the argument, Anas, that yes, the country may be awash in weapons, but if the international community doesn't make its mind up and intervene quickly in a more forceful and decisive way, the winner of this conflict might not be either Tobruk or Tripoli, it might be groups like ISIS.
Well, we can consider that question if we understand that both sides are actually interested in purely fighting ISIS, and I don't think that is the case today. Lifting the arms embargo may have a questionable amount of impact on ISIS, but it will also fuel the appetite for a civil war, and it already has, and most of the weapons have already been fueling the civil war. So unless we address the primary question, how do we find a political settlement, and then how can we find a unification government from there, and then begin to address the granular local questions, where ISIS, unfortunately, at a granular local level, in urbanized but also unurbanized rural areas, is taking grip. And I think in that respect, military options at the moment, particularly when fighting ISIS, and particularly given the circumstances on the ground, are limited, and I think their effectiveness is even more limited.
What do you make of the, we've heard from the Tobruk administration, they're saying we're willing to accept international observers to come in and make sure that these weapons are used in the manner and by the people intended. Is that not a solution to ensure that this doesn't simply become a pipeline that fuels the fight between Tripoli and Tobruk administrations, and that there is used instead to confront whatever groups are deemed completely unacceptable and to protect oil fields and strategic installations?
I mean again, it's a perfectly legitimate claim that one can make. It's the same claims that were made by the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, the same claims that were made by the administration of Nur al-Maliki in Iraq. But for the most part, the primary, ultimate, or even military doctrine that is governing this has been to try to exterminate one side, exclude, marginalise the other side, and then look for other options, and perhaps even discredit one's political opponents as sympathisers of ISIS, or as members of ISIS, or at least in cahoots with ISIS. But I think that, again, we're missing the main fact here is that the ground, or the environment on the ground, is not conducive to this kind of operation. You'll have limited effectiveness, you'll have a limited capacity to engage ISIS, because for the most part, most of the security services that are on the side of Operation Dignity don't have access to most of the country. They don't even have access to an intelligence service that is working on the other side. So unless you have an environment that is conducive to that kind of operation, to that kind of slow, steady, calculated war on terror, then you can't fight this kind of, you can't fight this kind of enemy. You're fighting it on too many different battlefronts. All
right, I think when Anas is mentioning there the lack of inclusiveness by one side to another, I think we're getting into the allegations of Tobruk not being very inclusive to the other side. So I want to bring Mohammed back into the discussion. And Mohammed, doesn't Anas have a point? I mean, the idea, even if you say, we'll have international monitors to make sure how these weapons are actually used, when you have an administration that has now legitimized even a renegade general to take over the armed forces of one side. I mean, how can you honestly tell the world that we'll make sure that these weapons are going to be used legitimately when there are a lot of legitimacy questions surrounding key figures within the Tobruk administration now?
We do really have an inclusiveness problem in Libya. But we must understand that there is only one internationally recognized government in Libya and one democratically elected government in Libya. And
the court doesn't recognize that, though, does it? The court has a different take.
There are questions about the court, and that's a different issue. But until now, it is still the internationally recognized government and the elected government in Libya. And it is important to understand that inclusiveness is important. However, do we have a unity government in Libya that includes IS sympathizers or sympathizers with terrorist groups and elements that have supported these groups with weapons, politically and so on, over the last 3 years? That would be the idea of having a unity government. If we have a unity government that includes elements that are sympathetic to the cause of Ansar al-Sharia and the cause of Islamic State, it will not be productive. That is what we had over the last 3 or 4 years, and the results is what we are here. The results is what we see now: militias and terrorist groups with huge amounts of weapons and controlled territory and cities and towns throughout Libya. So it's very important to understand, yes, exclusiveness is important. However, it should not be an excuse to appease groups or to appease sympathizers with extremist and terrorist groups in Libya.
Well, as we've been saying, two rival governments have been vying for control since August last year in the eastern port of Tobruk, and recognised by the UN is what was the Council of Deputies, also known as the House of Representatives. Elected in June last year, it was declared unconstitutional, though, by Libya's Supreme Court, but continues to claim legitimacy. Now, in the other corner, we have in Tripoli the rival government presenting itself as a legal continuation of the General National Council, which was elected in 2012. Each has its own allies and armed forces, and attacks and airstrikes have been carried out against each other's positions. Both have also come under attack from ISIL, which is why UN-brokered talks in Morocco are trying to bring the two sides together. Oliver, do you think, is there a consensus amongst most world powers at this point that any lifting of an arms embargo, any heavy support of one side against the other, that all of those sort of steps should actually only take place after the formation of a national unity government?
I think I would differ from your analysis of the situation just now. You said that it was because of the threat from ISIS that the UN was trying to bring these sides together. I think the threat to ISIS is a secondary affair. The most important thing is the talks that are now going on in Morocco and are expected to continue next week in Algeria. And that's where we should be putting our money. This is the attempt at inclusiveness, bringing together these two rival claimants to be government. It's probably the case that supporters of ISIS and supporters of al-Qaeda will not join in those talks. Perhaps they won't even be invited. But I think that's secondary. The main point is that those talks have got to be backed. And coming back to the question with which you opened the programme about the arms embargo, my question, if I were advising governments on this now, would be, how can we relax the arms embargo in such a way that we will strengthen the talks? If we can do that, yes, I'm in favour of relaxing the embargo.
Is there a way to do that, Oliver?
But if relax, I don't know. I'm not in the talks. I'd need to talk to both sides in order to be able to answer that question. But if relaxing the embargo simply means backing one side, I'm not keen on it.
All right. el-Gomati, well, I wonder your take. Do you think that these talks have a better chance of succeeding now? At least we have both sides, apparently, going to be at the table, something we didn't have fully, at least in Geneva, in previous rounds of talks. Are you optimistic?
I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think that unless we address the real issues that are at hand now, I understand that one side is internationally recognised, but international recognition is no substitute for legitimate action. Now, if both sides are hell-bent on posing existential crises and existential threats to one another that they want to wipe out, they want to create institutions that marginalise, exclude and even exterminate their own political enemies and opponents, then there's absolutely no chance in hell that any of these talks will actually resume or even have any degree of success at a political level. At a military level, obviously a lot of the issues are at a local, granular level, as I've explained earlier on, and they don't include such highbrow ideological terms as nationalists and Islamists, but there are even much more, perhaps boring issues such as who governs trading posts and border posts, who's in charge of the security operations there, and in terms of the security sector. So security sector reform and calibrating a security sector that it takes into consideration the new realities on the ground, but also provides security and guarantees at a political level so that all actors can engage in the elections. And I think, to go further on this, perhaps not offering seats to many of the Islamists who did lose during the elections, but guaranteeing their political survival, explaining to them that perhaps you can go for the next election or the election afterwards. But many of the people that are fighting for Libya Dawn, or many even the people fighting for Libya Dignity, don't see themselves as having a chance in a new Libya, in a post-democratic Libya, because they feel that one side will counter-dominate the military apparatus, will counter-dominate the political apparatus, and even will marginalise their own, will marginalise the opposition through predatory actions at the ministerial level. Unless you have those kind of guarantees, talks won't resume, but talks won't have any chance of success. And again, at the military level, you have to have some kind of guarantees that at the local level you can get some granular, calibrated security situation, configuration, so that we can minimise all the political fog of war and try to concentrate on the main threat, which is again ISIS.
Oh, well, let me take some of those points you mentioned to Mohammed then in Tobruk. Why doesn't the Tobruk administration give its priority right now, a narrative goes, to giving some of those sorts of guarantees and measures to reach out to the Tripoli administration on the eve of talks, instead of pushing on the one hand, the allegation goes for more weapons from the international community, while what we heard earlier today, allegations that the Tobruk administration was bombing the airport in Tripoli, where members of the Tripoli administration were trying to fly out of to get to the Morocco talks. I mean, is the Tobruk administration being forthright in its commitment or honest in its commitment to, to these peace talks and inclusiveness?
Just to clarify that the airstrikes that were conducted on Tripoli and other parts in western Libya under the control of Libya Dawn were in response to attacks on the oil terminals in eastern Libya, and were in response to airstrikes on the city of Zintan. So these were a reaction to an action that happened earlier on. In answer to your question, the Libyan or the internationally recognized government in Tobruk has sought to engage with the city of Misrata and the leaders of the city of Misrata, because they do see a partner in the city of Misrata, and they are more willing to engage with the city of Misrata than to engage with Omar al-Hassi's government in Tripoli, a government that has denied the existence of Islamic State in Libya to this very moment. The other side will need to recognize the threat that's posed by Islamic State, and they need to show readiness to fight the threat or the terrorist groups like Islamic State in Libya in order to be included in any future unity government in Libya.
I'll take those points to Anis in a second, but very briefly, Mohammed, I'm curious to know a point which has been raised. If the Tobruk government has some international recognition and now also arms, how would that help Tobruk to be more inclusive in the peace talks, rather than thinking, hey, maybe we can finish this with weapons now that we're getting more and more support from the international community?
Any support to the internationally recognized government has to be conditional, and there has to be monitoring of the activities and the commitment of this government to the peace building in Libya and to becoming inclusive and representative government, of course.
All right. And Anis, briefly, what do you make of the suggestion there that there is a problem in the Tripoli side of the equation, not being able to recognize that there is a security problem, there is a threat, as Tobruk puts it, a terrorist threat and problem that is not being recognized, and perhaps even a blind eye being turned to by the Tripoli administration?
Well, many of the leaders of Operation Dawn have actually just buried their heads in the sand, and I think it's silly of them to do so, because let's make it clear, ISIS is not on anybody's side; it's on against both sides here, and it will be
just to clarify for viewers, when we talk
do.
about Operation Dawn, of course, that's the operation that is associated with the Tripoli administration. Sorry, just to clarify that. Go on, though.
But also that I'm also of the opinion that the political factions don't have entire command and control over any of the military factions, and I think it's going to be very difficult to monitor the way in which they conduct this kind of, the way in which they conduct the fighting. They've already refused the calls for ceasefires, and they do see it as a fight to the end, a very, very bitter fight to the end. I mean, in that respect, using ISIS as a political chip and using it in the service, or the truth of ISIS, and using it in the service is something very, very different to discredit one's opponents, to call them all sympathizers. I think if there are sympathizers there, if there are people that don't want to accept, then I think when we look at someone like Ahmad al-Hassi and we look at most of Operation Dawn, it's almost predictable that they would bury their heads in the sand. What do you expect them to do? They feel, Operation Dignity and Khalifa Haftar breathing down their necks, on military, political and economic and diplomatic fronts. And I think in that respect, once we remove most of this fighting, or the needless fighting for the political and military assets of the country, then we can really kind of sit down and talk about the real issues. But if they want to fight, if Operation Dignity wants to fight ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the notion of a political opposition, which I also feel is very much in the way in which Operation Dawn wants to fight as well. They want to dominate and monopolize their control over the political factions. And I think unless you get those kind of guarantees, the ground is not conducive to fighting ISIS. It's going to be separate, and it's going to be disjointed, it's going to be in complete disarray.
Oliver, what does the international community want from Libya at this point? Is it in confusion, disarray? Is it lost interest? Or is it simply concerned with keeping as much of the oil industry or the oil flow intact?
I don't think the oil is relevant to the argument we're having at the moment. The fact is, Libyan oil is of course an important factor in itself. The Libyans, whatever the political solution eventually to the problems of Libya may be, Libya will want to sell its oil to the world, and the world will want to buy it. But that's not affecting the argument at the moment. I think the answer to your question is that the international community wants to see a government, in the full sense of the word, restored in Tripoli. They want to see an end to this very destructive fighting, which is causing more and more bloodshed, as a matter of fact, although the scale of it is still limited compared with the terrible things that are happening in Syria or Iraq. And I think that's why, to come back to my main point, I think that the international community is backing the talks which are now going on in Morocco. I think that the whole question of arms, which is a very complicated one because there are so many factions, both political and military, roughly speaking 2 alliances, but it's much more complicated than that. I think that the question of arms should be one of the tools in the hands of the UN representative.
Let me jump in, Oliver. You say that oil isn't really, perhaps the big question now, but it is an awkward situation, is it not, when you have what we hear and told, that the international community is giving more recognition to the Tobruk side of the equation, and yet the attack that occurred on al-Dhahra oil field was one which was repelled by the Tripoli administration's guards, from what we understand, and according to what's been quoted by news agencies, at least, quoting the Tripoli-based oil minister, Mashallah Zewi. And we have a consortium of 3 American oil companies operating in that oil field. I mean, how does that all add up? Is there a bit of confusion as to where the international powers see their interests, or are they really defining it simply as, let's keep the oil going?
Well, of course everyone wants to keep the oil going. It would be mad not to. The Libyans want to sell their oil, as I've said, and we, the rest of the world, want to buy it. That doesn't require any great mind to understand that. What its relevance is to the argument we've been having earlier in this discussion, I'm not so sure.
Well, I mean, is it not curious that international consortiums are put together working with a side that, according to the narrative, is not the internationally recognised one? We're doing business with the side that we consider to be, internationally unrecognised.
Those international consortiums have existed for some years. They haven't been put together in the present situation. At the moment, they're hoping for the best. And of course, if the oil fields are attacked, as they were yesterday or the day before yesterday, by forces claiming to be aligned with ISIS, and if other forces come and deal with them, that's good news. And it's also good news, incidentally, in the context of what we were discussing just now. Are Libya Dawn and the Tripoli government hopelessly in bed with ISIS? It appears not. It appears that they were actually prepared to fight them in the oil fields. Perhaps that's good news. Perhaps that will be good news in the talks in Morocco.
All right, time will tell, I guess. I think we're out of time for this show, though. We're going to have to thank our guests very much for joining us here. Mohammed Al-Jarh, Oliver Miles and Anas el-Gomati. And thank you for joining us on this episode of Inside Story. As always, if you've got anything to add to the show, head over to our programme page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or send us your tweets to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. From the whole team for now, it's goodbye.